Good afternoon again. Our next presentation is being done by Mr. Tom Schoenfeldt on the risks in food processes. So if you would come down, Tom.
Thank you all for coming. This is normally, when you deal with the food industry, it's a bit of a different topic at this kind of conference. So let's start out. Let me ask you a question. How many of you ate lunch today? It was a good lunch, wasn't it? How many of you thought about, was there any risks with you eating that lunch? Do we think about it? You know, often when we look in the manufacturing arena, we're looking at a part that we can absolutely measure. But in a food system, may not necessarily be the case. Because the only way that I can guarantee that I don't have any problems is 100% testing. And if I'm preparing canned food, am I going to open every can and test it? Because when you're dealing with subjects like bacteria, it's everywhere. Can I guarantee that it's always gone? No, it won't be. So, as we begin to look at the risks, the other piece that comes into play is as we look at each individual, okay, we have what I describe as our own risk appetite. What are we willing to accept? Where in some cases, okay, if I do this, I run the risk of a $100,000 issue. Some folks are going to say, I can't do that. That's too big a risk. I'll do something else. Well, there'll be others that'll step up and say, that's peanuts. I'll go without it. So that to say that the risks run on an absolute scale are not the same. Now, in many cases, the government today is trying to tell us that if you make product A, it doesn't matter. These are the risks that you face. And if I come in to do an audit or an inspection on your facility, I better find these dealt with. Is that a good way to do it? No. But that's the way the federal inspectors are being trained to come into our food facilities today. Now, the other piece is when you are familiar with an ISO standard, when they talked about traceability, how far did we go? What do we look at when we're looking for traceability? Normally just one step forward and one step backward, right? Now, in our new rules, when you look at the supply chain in the food industry, the way the new rules are written is if we start up here, over there in the corner where it says the seed, the soil, and the farmer. Every food company now becomes liable from that point all the way down here at the bottom where it says the end consumer will eat it. the whole compass. Now, when we look at up in this area, okay, what are some of the risks that we might see there? We can get things like pesticide residues, because depending on where the product is coming from, what country, there are materials that are allowed that are banned in the United States. Or the other countries may have. And let's ask the other question. If you do some of those things on that top line, how does the politics of the situation get involved? Do you think it's possible for the political situation to get involved in the food industry? Think about spices as an example. Where do they come from? Let's pick on cumin. We had a cumin recall here a few months ago. Where does that come from primarily? Does anybody know? Turkey, Iran, Syria. Would you trust a certificate of conformance from one of those nations based on our political situation and relation with them? And you know, in most cases, it shouldn't be. But with the kind of world that we live in, we have to begin to look at what is happening all around us and how it impacts us. They started out, there was a whole bunch of rules around with the Food and Drug Administration. And in October of 2011, Congress passed the Food Safety Modernization Act. Have any of you heard of that? But what happens in the rule that's there for human food, what the stipulation says, that every member of that supply chain is responsible from there to there. And let's say I'm in here. I have to be able to prove upon an inspection that the product is safe all the way back through here, and that these folks up through here are handling it correctly. Now, this is part of the reason that today we're not seeing a whole lot of inspections being done. And you're not seeing a lot of non-compliances and stuff like that issued by the FDA, because what are they actually expecting from them as they look at this? If I can't control this, okay, if I'm over here in the finished product at that stage, if I can show that I have a kill step where I can guarantee that that product is good, I don't have to worry about whether this stuff is there or not. For example, if I do pasteurization, or if I do something like cooking that's going to kill it, you know, in their terminology, the kill step, that kind of covers everything before it, because now I only have to worry about what's after it. But again, we also live in a very, very strange society. And I used the example, okay, let's say I went out and it's a 95-degree day outside, and I go shopping and I buy some meat at the grocery store, and I pack it up and put it in the trunk of my car. While I'm out, I decide, hey, maybe I ought to go visit my grandkids. So I do. Several hours later, I get home. And then after a while, ooh, I got meat in the car. I take it out, and I don't really cook it right, but I eat it and get sick. Who's responsible for that if I get sick? Is the store where I bought that meat responsible, or am I? What do you think? If you go into a court of law today, some of the grocery stores have been found liable because it still had their label on it. And see, this is the kind of complexity and responsibility that's still being sorted out as we look at the food chain. It's not everything that we'd like it to be. It's not sweet and pretty. We're running in some really, really, really muddy water. As an example, they have two types of risks. And it's easy to find as food safety as unintentional contamination. You know, you've got something that happened in your facility that contaminated the food. But a new term that has come up is this food security, where you've got intentional contamination. How many have any of you had any experience with disgruntled employees? I can, you know, when I see that, you know, you've got somebody that comes back in with the intention of creating an issue, will contaminate the food. The one that happened in China a number of years ago is they intentionally put melamine in baby formula. You get things that will happen, like I'm from the Detroit area. In Ann Arbor, we had a young man come into a Whole Foods market, and he had a little sprayer with him, and he sprayed the produce. The content of that sprayer was antifreeze and rat poison. You talk about an absolute circus, because that immediately brought in the FBI. Is this man a terrorist? Got Homeland Security. Where's he from? What's going on? All of the health departments, all of the state departments, and everything like that had to get involved in this investigation, figure out what was going on. But the biggest question that remained was there were 12 grocery stores in Ann Arbor. How many more did he go to that didn't have video of him doing it because they didn't have cameras on the produce? But these are the kind of things that we're dealing with. Years ago, we could get tours into a food plant, relatively simple, just like a lot of the manufacturing facilities. Not anymore. Part of the requirements of the laws today is you have to extremely limit the access to the facilities. And you have to be able to have a mechanism to identify every individual that's in that facility. Do they belong there or don't they? I've been in facilities that they have like a blue hairnet for visitors, a red one for contract workers, and a white one for the people that work there. Excuse me, so they know who they are and they have a purpose to be there. But it's not like a few years ago. These are some of the causes that we can see when we begin to look at unintentional contamination. Process failures. You can get exposure to different forms of bacteria. The scary thing when we look at this, the FDA can come in and swab your whole food facility with 200 to 300 swabs. Now, one of the big serious questions, if somebody comes into a facility, I want a duplicate test to make sure they're getting the right one, right? So that I can verify their results. But in a situation like this, do I want it? Probably not. Because if I get a positive and they get a negative, I'm in good shape. But if I get a positive and they know I got a positive, I got to answer. So what you'll find that they do is just take your samples and just let me see what you get. And one of the biggest issues that they have is they feed all of these, they run a DNA on the bacteria they find, like the Listeria monocytogenes. They have a DNA structure for about 1 million different strings of that, and they can't identify where it came from. Heaven forbid they walk into your facility and find one of those, because every one of those that are in their database has been tied to a number of recalls. And they're coming after you if it matches. And those are the kind of things that are hanging out there over us. We look at intentional contamination. I mean, a few years ago, who would have even thought about this? But this is the kind of people that we're having to deal with. You get people that, malicious insiders as an example. Well, what's going to happen if we do this? Let's see what happens. The disgruntled employee. Somebody's trying to get in the facility to do damage for you. The other piece of this, how many of you like honey? You know what one of the best ways to lower the price of honey? Add corn syrup. Will a consumer know the difference? 9 chances out of 10, no. And that's why the subject of fraud is up there, because they're selling something as honey that really isn't honey, as an example. Where it really comes into play as far as the food fraud goes is with fish. Because you'll find over and over again, you'll find products like tilapia being sold as red snapper. And the interesting part is, if you look at the market prices, they're significantly different. So they're making more money off of a lower value fish. And see, there's some of the things that can happen. The biggest one you've got is your microbial contamination. Because that's not measured as an absolute. You're looking, does it test positive, and how much is there? The residues. We have equipment breakdowns, okay? If a bolt comes out, it's going to end up somewhere. I was in a bakery where they made Danish, and they had this metal like a finger that reached down, picked up that Danish, and set it up on a conveyor to be wrapped. What happens if one of those fingers falls off or it sticks in the side of it and stays there? It happens. And that's where you get into the metal and foreign materials. One of the biggest causes today for recalls is an undeclared allergen. You know, if you look, there's 8 major allergens, and part of this stuff, like even if you go into a coffee shop, in many cases today, you'll see a sign made in a facility that handles tree nuts to protect themselves from the allergen requirements. And those are the, and when we start to look at how do we begin the process to measure these. Now, if we look at in process, we use some stiff cleaning chemicals in the food industry because we're looking for a way that they will kill the bacteria. Many of the good microbial cleaning products, I'll be honest with you, leave a residue. And that's an intentional that is designed into them. I can say that because over the years I actually formulated them. And like it would leave a film on it which would keep the bacteria from growing. You have stuff that goes bad. Then you go down to the allergen again. They have 2 terms, cross-contact or contamination. Did it even come in contact with another allergen? Or did it get some of that stuff potentially even in the product? And the reason you look at that is because there are times that if you get an individual with like a peanut allergy or a nut allergy, that can be enough to make them go into shock. And the same thing can happen if we look at the finished product. One of the interesting things, when you look at what is the final point in a food operation before the product is okay to go out the door, 9 chances out of 10, it's a magnet. Because that's what they're using right before they package it. And as it falls down or gets packaged, that's what they're using as their final judgment that it's okay to go. Now, is that going to, that's what it has been now. Is that going to do? A lot of times, you'll do the typical stuff with the testing. Process, finished product, incoming, processing areas. But you have to determine what kind of food have I got. I was in a plant that made hummus. And picture this, one of their controls was the temperature of the warehouse that they were working in, because it couldn't go above 35. Because that's how they maintain the integrity of their product. If it went to 36, everything they made was gone. Now, when we start looking at risk management, this is where we put the controls in place so that we can make sure that these events aren't going to happen. The one thing when I come to this, that can you imagine being a governmental body that has been given the responsibility to eliminate foodborne illness? That's what the FDA has been charged with. Is that a possibility? No. Ultimately, they've been almost given an impossible task. Because as an example, we can make ourselves sick as well as anywhere along in the supply chain. But they've got to stop it all. So that's why we're seeing some of these rules come out. How many of you have heard terms like this? HACCP, H-E, HARPC, TACCP, VACCP, and SWAT. In many other manufacturing industries, we don't have to worry about threats, vulnerability. The hazard analysis. This is what was accepted for years in the food industry. Very, very similar if you were in the manufacturing to an FMEA. But they didn't take it the last step where you put it, control and a responsibility on it. How are we going to fix it? HARPC does that. This is what the new requirement is. And it's called Hazard Analysis Risk-Based Preventive Control. So that they make it very, very similar to what the manufacturing folks would be doing with an FMEA. But if they come into a facility, they're looking at all of these. You know, what have you done? Have you addressed those issues? These are the folks that can come and visit. They're starting to approve with, see, the FDA is starting to say that some of the state departments of agriculture can do their inspections, and they're writing contracts with them to do them. But, and you're starting to see the voluntary standards. A year or so ago, if you were one of the GFSI standards, Global Food Safety Initiative, SQF, BRC, FSSC, any of those standards, if you were registered to those, you were good to go. Well, when the Food Safety Modernization Act came out, those schemes went out the window. It no longer mattered because those were not compliant with what they expected. So over the last year and a half or so, those standards bodies have been working on trying to get their schemes up so that they meet the level of the FDA requirements. Now, is the FDA willing to accept that? We'll have to wait and see. They should, because if you have what they're looking for, they don't really care whether you're audited something else. These are some of the, I tell people, not very good reading, okay? The Food Safety Modernization Act, the rule for human food when it came out and was finally issued was 960 pages long. And then they had 6 other ones. The backbone of the whole system has been, over the years, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And how many of you have run into like a state food law? What gets interesting is you can get access often into a food facility that may not even be registered, and they can use the requirements that are listed in a state food law to get in there. And right now, there's a whole lot of, I'm going to say almost overlap between the USDA and the FDA. Because, you know, as an example, the chickens and the shelled egg is covered by the USDA. But if I crack that egg or do anything to it, it becomes the responsibility of FDA. And they're trying, and that's why the Congress is actually trying to work on a way that's going to try to combine that and simplify it so that they have an oversight body. But my hope is that if they do this, that they're not going to just be creating more bureaucracy, which we run a very high risk with that. This is the Food Safety Modernization Act. These are the 7, what they call pillars. The preventive controls for human food, that's the one that's 960 pages long. But that describes their requirements for human food. In that, you have the supply chain requirements, which is an underlying piece of this. It's also an underlying piece of that one. That you have to deal with the whole supply chain. Then they have the specific one for animal food. Then they have one for produce. Can you imagine, they're still arguing today over the water requirement that can be used on a farm. You know, the number of samples that need to be taken and what kind of results need to be tested for. They run into issues, okay? If I irrigate with pond water, will that pond water have bacteria in it? Absolutely. So they're trying to set limits on how much bacteria can be in the water that I use for irrigation. And as they talk to farmers, they're getting some interesting feedback, but we'll wait and see what comes out of there. Third-party auditors, how are they setting up the system to be able to have somebody other than the FDA do it? When I was here last year, I talked about the National Organic Program, where they have their certifying bodies. It's a very similar situation with this third-party auditor rule. Then you've got sanitary transportation. This is dealing with all the trucks and railroad cars and everything like that. And when you look at that rule, it's the carrier, the shipper, the receiver, and the loader that they're looking at in that rule. And everything that can happen. Foreign suppliers. You know, we live in a global economy. A lot of our food does not come from right around here. The biggest question that came up was who owns that food when it comes into the United States? because in most cases, there's a broker involved. Now, the broker's the one that has to now make sure that that product is in compliance. Previously, it was just almost a transparent transition that this goes from this guy through the broker to here. But now that broker has some responsibility. And then the intentional adulteration. They're hitting now all of the aspects that they had to have them be in compliance with them. There's a list of some of the voluntary standards that I was talking about. And they're well established. Which one is better? Depends on the operation. Because I'll be honest with you, a lot of the smaller ones will fit better into that than into that. These are more ISO-based. But it's what the organization has and what they're comfortable with, which one fits best. Anyway, risks are an adventure. I did a simple tofu plant as an inspector. He did things that would not want me to make tofu. But the FDA came in and they didn't give him one of their 483s, which in non-compliance, he got like 15. And instead of shutting him down, they made an agreement with him that they would come back every 3 months and he would pay for their inspections, or he would close his doors. The risk, you know, as consumers, it's very, very easy for us to ignore and not really understand the risks we're dealing with. I wrestle with the idea that the FDA can demand recalls. How much can a recall cost a company? Does a recall have the possibility to bankrupt a company? Yes. Because I've seen recalls where they go back and they want you to recall the last 1.5 to 2 years of the product. Okay, how do I do that? You know, that's where you start to get into having an information system that can tell you rather quickly where that stuff went and how can I get it back. Anyway, thank you for your time. Is there any questions? There's a whole lot of stuff like this available on the FDA's website. If you want to get scared when you look at recalls, go into a website, the FDA's website, fda.gov/recalls. And you'll see 2 or 3 pages in there that were the last week. Anyway, again, thank you for your attention. Thank you for coming.